Throughout history, influence has never been a simple exchange of words or gestures. It has always been shaped by timing, perception, restraint, and the silent spaces between actions. Long before modern psychology gave names to these concepts, thinkers were already observing how human attention, attraction, and emotional focus move in patterns rather than straight lines. According to a controversial historical narrative often attributed to Niccolò Machiavelli, influence was not built through overt force or constant presence, but through subtle positioning. While no verified document proves he wrote a specific manuscript on personal attraction, later interpretations describe a fictional experiment that explored how curiosity, emotional contrast, and controlled presence shape human connection. This account is best understood not as instruction, but as a study of perception and behavioral response. The central idea was simple. People do not become emotionally engaged through logic alone. They respond to impressions, uncertainty, rhythm, and meaning they assign on their own. When everything is clear and predictable, the mind rests. When something is incomplete, the mind leans forward. In this narrative, attraction is not portrayed as persuasion, but as psychological attention. Attention grows where something feels unresolved. The story begins with the concept of scarcity, not absence, but measured availability. The text suggests that constant visibility removes contrast. When someone is always present, nothing about their presence stands out. Value, in this framework, is created through boundaries rather than intensity. A recurring theme in the manuscript is restraint. Influence, it claims, is weakened by over-explanation. The more a person explains themselves, the less space remains for interpretation. And interpretation is where emotional engagement forms. In a series of fictional observations, individuals who maintained a balanced distance were perceived as more intriguing. Not distant enough to seem uninterested, but not available enough to feel predictable. This balance produced curiosity, and curiosity encouraged voluntary attention. Importantly, the narrative emphasizes that attention given freely is more powerful than attention demanded. When someone chooses to engage without pressure, the engagement feels authentic, even if shaped by subtle circumstances. The next concept explored is emotional contrast. According to the manuscript, strong bonds do not form through constant emotional tone, but through variation. Calm moments gain meaning after intensity. Silence feels deeper after conversation. Stability becomes valuable only when contrasted with uncertainty. This is not framed as manipulation, but as observation. The human mind notices change more than consistency. In these fictional experiments, individuals who varied the emotional rhythm of interaction were remembered more vividly. The reason was not what they said, but when they said it. Timing transformed ordinary moments into memorable ones. Another idea discussed is rhythm. Communication is not only content, but pace. Immediate responses feel efficient, but delayed responses create space. That space invites reflection. Reflection leads to emotional processing. Silence, in this framework, is not absence. It is an active psychological environment where meaning is constructed internally. The manuscript repeatedly returns to one principle. People attach more strongly to what they partially understand than to what is fully explained. This leads into the concept of selective alignment. Rather than constant agreement, meaningful connection formed when similarities appeared during emotionally relevant moments. Shared values expressed at the right time carried more weight than constant affirmation. The narrative stresses that this was not imitation, but resonance. People felt understood when alignment appeared naturally, not repeatedly. Another recurring symbol in the manuscript is eye contact. It is not described romantically, but attentively. Eye contact is portrayed as a signal of presence, not dominance. When sustained briefly and released naturally, it communicated confidence without pressure. Again, the manuscript emphasizes moderation. Excess reduces impact. As the narrative progresses, it shifts from individual moments to long-term perception. The idea introduced here is memory imprinting. Certain moments stay not because they are intense, but because they are rare. A small, unexpected gesture, when not repeated, gains disproportionate meaning. The human mind searches for patterns. When a pattern does not repeat, it remains open. The manuscript describes this as unfinished perception. An experience that does not fully close continues internally. Another concept explored is ambiguous affirmation. Instead of direct praise, subtle observations leave room for interpretation. These are not compliments, but reflections. When someone hears a reflection that feels personal but undefined, they revisit it mentally. This internal dialogue deepens engagement without any external reinforcement. The text then introduces the idea of presence beyond presence. Not messages, not reminders, but association. When someone becomes linked to emotional states rather than constant communication, they remain present even in absence. This is described not as strategy, but as psychological residue. Emotions leave traces. Traces become memory. Memory becomes meaning. The manuscript repeatedly warns against overexposure. When everything is shared too quickly, there is nothing left to discover. Discovery, it argues, is the engine of sustained interest. In later sections of this first part, the focus shifts to identity perception. People are not drawn to others as they are, but as they experience themselves around them. Attraction forms when someone feels more aware, more engaged, or more alive in another's presence. The manuscript frames this as reflective amplification. One person becomes a mirror that highlights certain traits in the other. Importantly, the text does not advocate deception. It speaks of emphasis rather than invention. Traits already present become more visible through context. Tone, posture, pacing, and listening are all described as contributors to this effect. Silence is again highlighted as informative. What people avoid saying often reveals more than what they share. Emotional cues appear in pauses, shifts, and micro-expressions. In this fictional study, those who noticed these signals responded not by probing, but by allowing space. Space created safety. Safety encouraged voluntary openness. The first part concludes with a central observation that summarizes the entire framework. People do not become emotionally connected to another person. They become connected to the version of themselves that emerges in that person's presence. This idea frames the remainder of the manuscript, which moves into deeper psychological territory in its later sections. What follows in the next part explores how narratives, memory, and internal dialogue shape long-term emotional attachment, areas that require careful, ethical discussion and will be addressed in the continuation. The second part of the narrative moves beyond initial attention and into the deeper mechanics of sustained emotional focus. At this stage, the manuscript no longer discusses moments, gestures, or impressions in isolation. Instead, it examines how repeated emotional patterns quietly reorganize perception over time. The central idea introduced here is internal narrative formation. According to the text, long-term attachment is not created by what one person does, but by the story the other person constructs to explain those actions. Human beings seek coherence. When emotional experiences feel intense but undefined, the mind instinctively builds meaning around them. The manuscript argues that influence becomes powerful when the other person believes they are the author of that meaning. This section introduces what it calls guided interpretation. Rather than defining intentions, the individual allows ambiguity to exist. Small fragments of information are shared, never the complete picture. These fragments invite interpretation rather than explanation. When people interpret on their own, they become invested in the conclusion. The narrative emphasizes that certainty closes curiosity, while ambiguity sustains it. Another major theme in this part is emotional pacing over extended time. The manuscript suggests that emotional consistency does not create depth. Instead, depth emerges from variation that remains balanced. Too much intensity exhausts attention. Too much distance dissolves relevance. The balance between the two maintains engagement. This balance is described as emotional rhythm. In the fictional experiment described, individuals who maintained this rhythm were remembered not for dramatic actions, but for emotional presence that felt significant without being overwhelming. The text repeatedly clarifies that presence does not mean availability. Presence refers to attentiveness when engaged, not constant engagement itself. The next concept explored is perceived exclusivity. This does not mean exclusion of others, but the feeling of being uniquely understood. According to the manuscript, people attach emotionally when they believe someone recognizes aspects of them that others overlook. This recognition is not declared, it is implied. Subtle observations, phrases that acknowledge depth without defining it, encourage the other person to feel seen without being exposed. The manuscript stresses restraint here. Recognition that is too explicit feels invasive. Recognition that is understated feels rare. Another idea developed in this section is controlled contrast. Emotional contrast is presented not as instability, but as dimension. Calm moments become meaningful when contrasted with intensity. Seriousness feels grounded when paired with lightness. Human emotion responds to contour, not flatness. The narrative describes how extended interaction benefits from moments that end before they feel complete. Conversations that stop at a high point linger longer in memory than conversations that fully resolve. This is referred to as open-loop engagement. When a moment remains unfinished, the mind continues it internally. Silence again plays a central role. Silence following meaningful interaction is described as more impactful than silence following neutrality. The emotional residue left behind determines how silence is interpreted. The manuscript introduces the idea of associative memory. When emotional experiences occur in distinct contexts, specific places, tones, or moments, the mind links those contexts to the person involved. Later, when similar emotions appear, the association is triggered automatically. This process is described neutrally as memory anchoring. It is not forced. It emerges naturally when intensity and timing align. As the manuscript continues, it shifts focus toward internalization. At this stage, the person is no longer reacting only to external interaction. They begin to reference the other internally. This is identified as cognitive presence. Cognitive presence occurs when someone's perspective becomes part of another person's internal dialogue. Decisions, reflections, and emotional responses begin to include an imagined reference point. The text describes this as the transition from interaction to integration. Importantly, the manuscript does not frame this as conscious intention. It presents it as a byproduct of repeated emotional relevance. The next concept introduced is selective disclosure. Contrary to common belief, revealing everything does not build trust. The manuscript suggests that trust grows when disclosure feels intentional rather than exhaustive. Small, authentic disclosures offered at meaningful moments feel more valuable than complete transparency delivered too early. These disclosures are not confessions. They are fragments that signal depth without defining it. The narrative then explores emotional reciprocity. When one person shares something meaningful, the other often responds by sharing something of similar weight. This exchange builds perceived balance. However, the manuscript notes that balance does not mean equality in volume, but equality in perceived significance. Another theme explored is adaptive resonance. Over time, people subtly adjust their emotional expression to match those they feel connected to. This synchronization happens unconsciously. When emotional rhythms align, interaction feels effortless. The manuscript suggests that this alignment reinforces the perception of compatibility even when differences exist. As Part 2 progresses, the text becomes more reflective. It emphasizes that attachment is not sudden. It accumulates through repeated internal confirmations. People begin to justify inconsistencies rather than question them. The manuscript identifies this as narrative protection. Once a personal story forms, the mind protects it from disruption. At this stage, interpretation becomes more powerful than evidence. The text introduces the idea of emotional priority. When someone occupies emotional priority, they are considered first in moments of reflection, stress, or joy. This priority is not assigned consciously. It emerges from repeated emotional relevance. The manuscript then discusses perceived inevitability. When patterns repeat with emotional significance, people begin to believe the connection is meaningful beyond coincidence. Language subtly shifts from "this happened" to "this always happens." This shift transforms experience into expectation. Expectation deepens attachment. Another concept examined is symbolic meaning. Over time, small shared references gain symbolic value. These symbols are not grand. They are ordinary moments imbued with emotional memory. Symbols are powerful because they compress experience into recall. The manuscript argues that symbolic memory sustains connection even during absence. At this point, the narrative introduces the concept of emotional economy. Attention, reassurance, and validation are described as emotional resources. When given continuously, their value diminishes. When given selectively, their impact increases. This is not described as withholding, but as pacing. Pacing preserves meaning. The manuscript also examines internal alignment. When people feel aligned with someone's values or worldview, they experience confirmation of their own identity. This alignment strengthens attachment because it reinforces self-concept. The narrative emphasizes that people are drawn to those who make them feel more coherent internally. Another idea explored is reflective growth. When interaction prompts self-reflection, the source of that reflection becomes associated with personal development. People value those who appear connected to their growth. This does not require instruction. It emerges through thoughtful questions, attentive listening, and shared contemplation. The manuscript then discusses emotional permanence. When someone remains emotionally relevant even during physical absence, permanence begins to form. At this stage, presence becomes internal rather than external. The text identifies this as consolidation. Once consolidated, emotional attachment becomes self-sustaining. The manuscript also warns that at this point, interpretation becomes resistant to change. New information is filtered through the existing narrative. This is not unique to relationships. It reflects a broader human tendency toward cognitive consistency. The final sections of Part 2 focus on stabilization. Emotional experiences transition from novelty to integration. Intensity becomes less frequent but more meaningful. Silence becomes familiar rather than uncertain. Connection becomes assumed rather than questioned. The manuscript concludes this part with a key observation. Lasting emotional attachment is not created by constant interaction, dramatic gestures, or perfect compatibility. It forms when another person becomes part of one's internal emotional structure. When this happens, distance no longer dissolves connection. Time no longer weakens relevance. Absence no longer ends presence. The narrative suggests that this stage marks the threshold beyond attraction and into enduring emotional significance. The remainder of the manuscript, according to historical commentary, continues into philosophical reflection rather than behavioral analysis, questioning whether influence of this depth should be pursued at all. But that exploration belongs to interpretation, not instruction. And so, the second part ends where psychology meets ethics, leaving the reader not with methods, but with awareness.